Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on the Trump administration's Middle East policy with a special focus on Yemen and Iran, namely the current war between the United States and the Houthi rebels in Yemen that started in the middle of March, and the simultaneous negotiations between the United States and Iran with regard to Iran's nuclear weapons issue, the exchange of not developing nuclear weapons for support in the domain of the economy, considering Iran's very difficult economic conditions, given that there are US/Western sanctions against Iran that they have been in place for some time. Now, on the face of it, the issue of the role of the Trump administration in the Middle East versus the issue of the Middle East and war in the Middle East versus the broader issue of the Trump administration's neo-isolationist foreign policy, as well as the endeavors to bring an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine, may seem contradictory, makes no sense, given the public statements of the Trump administration in the first term from 2017 to 2021, as well as in the second administration, that the United States, according to Trump, should not be entangled in wars from which it cannot extricate itself and have no derivative benefits. Yet, while it has been making very generous offers to Russia, especially according to the neoconservatives in Washington, D.C. and Europe, and to the disappointment of NATO partners, in order to bring an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. At the same time, Trump launched an congressionally unauthorized war on March 15th against Yemen, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, although in reality, of course, when you look at the targets, they have all been civilian. The vast majority of those hit are civilian targets. Now, there is a question of why is the United States under Trump doing this? There are analysts who argue, well, the Israeli lobby is very powerful, and it is the Trump administration is following the lead of the Israelis to hit the Houthi rebels in Yemen, considering that the Houthi rebels have been about the only effective entity, a rebel group. Some argue that Hezbollah is right behind them in Lebanon, also with links to Iran. Both Houthis and Hezbollah have links to Iran, as does Hamas. At least ideological, some technical support, some financial support. One could argue that the United States is following the Israeli lobby and the Israeli government wishes of targeting the Houthi rebels in Yemen, because the Houthi rebels have been the only real entity of combating using military force, in other words, drones and missiles, to obstruct the Israeli war against the Palestinians, which, according to the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, is a war of genocide with war crimes committed, war crimes against humanity committed. So this is one issue. The other issue is that the United States does not view the situation of its bilateral relations with Russia, which it wants to use as perhaps bring it around and use it as a counterweight to China, although that's really sort of delusional thinking that given the very deep roots in Russia-China relations these days, thanks to the United States, by the way. And it sees its role in the Middle East very differently, considering that it's not just Israel, but also Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates historically against Iran, historically vying for the balance of power in the Middle East with Iran, at the same time also with Turkey. So Iran, Turkey, and Israel all struggling to have a voice in the balance, in the regional balance of power, in the United States siding with Israel, and in this case, the converging interests of Israel and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the Gulf states, in other words, in Yemen, make it much easier for the Trump administration to target the Houthi rebels. Now, broadly speaking, the United States policy toward the Middle East, bipartisan, it has nothing to do with the Trump administration. This goes back to the Nixon administration, actually. It has been, and it has become even more so, a destabilizing policy. The ultimate goal of the United States has been to destabilize, and this, the region, by the way, and the United States destabilization policy is really based on early Cold War a framework that it was established by the Truman administration with the enunciation, the promulgation, I should say, of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, when President Harry Truman announced that Iran, Turkey next to it, and Greece, if you look on a map, it forms sort of an umbrella, a corridor that protects the energy rich Middle Eastern resources that the United States in the 1940s and to the present deems very important. The United States in the Truman era, and of course, until the revolution of 1979 in Iran, had the power, the military and economic power and political muscle to impose hegemony over the Middle East, especially after the United States CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, overthrew the duly elected government of Iran in 1953. The Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who was elected, duly elected, but wanted the most important resource of Iran, the most important export product, namely oil, to be under national control rather than exploited, and a return to the government budget, very little at that, by the British Petroleum Company. So the United States was wanted Iran on its side. It wanted the oil of Iran. It wanted the Iran to be part of the overall U.S. configuration in the Middle East, U.S. hegemonic configuration in the Middle East. and it wanted Iran to be on its side rather than independent. Iran was not pro-Soviet. Mohammad Mossadegh was not pro-Soviet. The Tudeh party, the Communist Party of Iran, was somewhat supportive. It was supportive of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was an independent, but certainly this was not. The United States framed it as an issue of if you're not with us, you're against us. Therefore, you're with the Soviet Union. This is in the early Cold War period, so it's perfectly understandable why this propaganda element was injected into foreign policy, either us or them situation. The situation with the United States and Yemen really starts during the Obama administration. However, it was during the George W. Bush period when, after George W. Bush invaded both Afghanistan, sent troops to both Afghanistan and invaded Afghanistan, and then Iraq. Shortly thereafter, in 2004, there was an outbreak in Yemen between the Houthi rebels who are Shia and part of Zaidi Shia population, concentrated mostly in the northern part of Yemen, and the largely Sunni majority, by the way, it's 40-60. 40 are Shia, 60% are Sunni Muslims. This does not mean that these groups are homogeneous, because there are Sunnis supporting the Houthi rebels who are Shia, and there are Zaidis who are Shia who do not necessarily support the Houthi rebels. Now, ideologically, religiously, and politically, the fact is that the Houthi rebels, who are the armed group of the Shia faction, have been linked to Iran. However, I want to caution that the way the Western media has presented the issue of the Houthi rebels, especially from the Arab Spring in 2011 to the present, has been that the Houthi rebels are a proxy of Iran, and it's not exactly that. If those of you who have studied scholarly works on the Houthi rebels and their relationship to Iran, you know that this is not the case. However, this is how the Israeli government frames it, for obvious purposes, because it serves the interests of the Israeli government in competition for the regional balance of power in the Middle East, to blame everything that the Houthis are doing in Yemen on Iran, because Iran is the major rival and adamantly against the Zionist state, the apartheid state in Israel. And that is also the position, by the way, of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, as well as the United States and most of Western Europe, especially the UK and France. So there is convergence of perspective here that the Houthi rebels in Yemen are an extension of the Iranian government. And one reason for this is because the Western media are reflecting the position of Western governments and the Israeli government. And to some degree, the United Arab Emirates and the Saudi Arabia government's perspective is that, of course, Iran has this proxy group because it has Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and of course, it had in Syria pro-Iranian groups. That's gone now. That's no more. Since the fall of Bashar al-Assad in December of 2024, and it has such pro-Iranian groups in Iraq. So the idea is that Iran is somehow the puppeteer with all these groups. Now, it is true to a degree, but the question is to what degree. Iran is a sovereign country. It has these groups engaged in what we call unconventional warfare, that is guerrilla type of warfare. Um, all of them anti-Zionist, against the state of Israel, and some of them, most especially the Houthi rebels, obviously against the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, as well as Saudi Arabia, and their sponsors, the West. So one could look at this issue as follows: that if these rebel groups, Hezbollah, Houthi rebels, Hamas, the rebels that were in Syria now, and of course in Iraq, if they're the proxies of Iran, the Israeli government, the Saudi government, the United Arab Emirates are the proxies of the United States and Western Europe. So another way to look at it is to frame it is to look at it in typical Cold War East-West divide. Um, this view of the us and them, when in fact the reality is, again, on the ground is more complex, as we'll see. Now, the problems with in Yemen begin really with the Arab Spring, with the outbreak of the Arab Spring, which starts out against the authoritarian regimes, the autocratic regimes of the Arab world, the Afro-Arab Islamic countries in 2011, across North Africa, in Tunisia and Morocco, in Algeria, and of course, obviously in Egypt. That spreads to other places, including Yemen, but it finds expression, it found a different expression in Yemen, and by 2014, the Houthi minority manages to get rid of the pro Saudi president Mansour Hadi, who was in the capital Sana'a, and they take over Sana'a. And so the Houthi rebels confrontation between, or I should say, the Houthi rebels civil war between themselves and, of course, supported by Iran, and the Sunni pro-Saudi United Arab Emirates regime starts in 2014. Off and on, this goes on for about 8 years of armed conflict. And the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, all of them were providing both intelligence as well as military aid to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, the defense companies of the Western world. France, UK, and the United States loved nothing more than to sell weapons to the oil-rich Gulf Arab countries, which they used down in Yemen in the civil war. Now, the question is, what was this civil war about? Well, one could argue that it was about two religious factions, Shia versus Sunni, when in fact it was not, because there were many Sunnis that supported the Houthis, and there still are, and the idea that Sunnis would be pro-Israel, and many of them support a Western-backed Saudi UAE proxy war in Yemen for hegemony of the Gulf states in Yemen, which is exactly what the goal was, to impose Saudi, UAE, United Arab Emirates hegemony over Yemen is absurd because that is, it is absurd to think otherwise. It is absurd to think that this was not a conflict other than hegemony of the Gulf states that were backed by the United States and the West uh, in Yemen to impose this type of hegemony rather than to free Yemen, considering these are autocratic states, these are not democratic states. The Gulf states are authoritarian, by the way. Not that Iran is Norway by any stretch of the imagination. So we're not talking here about variations of democracy at all. This is a power struggle, pure and simple. Now, one tangible um, factor here is the Marib region in Yemen, which fell under, along with Sana'a, the capital, the Marib region, fell under the control of the Houthis. And the Marib region is where 90% of all the energy, oil and gas, supplied to the country comes from. And that region is very, very important. And that is one tangible thing that um, analysts point to. So the Civil War really has been off and on about that. The Saudis began to back off this partly because China managed to bring Iran and Saudi Arabia together, and as it invited both of them to be part of the BRICS group, and the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and China, as well as the realization of the Saudi Arabians that Iran was not as keen in Yemen as it had been portrayed. This doesn't mean that it was not supporting Houthis and that it does not support the Houthi rebels, but it had its own agenda and it had its own set of problems. And one of the reasons that it became involved in, it was very interested in becoming a member of the BRICS group, was precisely because it placed economic development, and it still does to this day, by the way, amid the negotiations on nuclear weapons between the United States and Iran. It places economic development far above nuclear weapons. Many Iranian analysts and government officials keep saying if we wanted nuclear weapons, we would have had them. We don't want them. We don't want that kind of risk because we know the next thing that we're going to be facing is Saudi Arabia will get them. We don't want to face that. And even the Trump administration literally made some off-the-cuff comments that the U.S. may go ahead and help Iran with nuclear energy, but even nuclear weapons development. Obviously, this was immediately dismissed, but the fact is that the Iranians know that, the West knows that, the Saudi Arabians know that if Iran wanted to develop nuclear weapons, it would have. It simply places itself at greater risk. Now, there's another issue here that's very important, and that is that the Iranian economy has been in shambles, partly because of Western sanctions. Western sanctions imposed on Iran have weakened the economy substantially. The fact is 25% of GDP in Iran is part of the illegal economy, the subterranean or informal economy. Inflation has averaged in the last 30 years or so averaged in the 30s. So 30% inflation is really hyperinflation. Now, the fact is that Iran is a theocratic state, but it is also a country that has a capitalist economy, but not integrated with the West as is Saudi Arabia, for example. It has informal ties with the West. It says oil to the West through back channels, and though through Trump administration recently has tried to tighten on that kind of sale of Iranian oil, but it has not enjoyed, because of Western sanctions, the kind of economic integration that the Gulf states have enjoyed, and that has cost the Iranian economy. It has cost the Iranian working class. And like I said, Iran is not a socialist country. Iran is a capitalist country and is interested in national capitalist development. It wants to develop its industries, and it wants to develop the energy sector, including nuclear energy, which is part of the negotiations that it has had with um, with the with the United States. Now, the Iran and the Houthi rebels in Yemen found common ground when the war broke out, when Israel declared war on Hamas, and actually it was a war against the civilians in Gaza, as it turned out, in October 2023. And the Yemen Houthis, the Houthis in Yemen, as well as Iran, made it very clear that they wanted a ceasefire. The Houthis did start um, several hits from Yemen to Israel, but they also did something else. They began to target ships going through the Red Sea. This is with the intelligence support of Iran, much later of China and Russia, but initially of Iran. Now, let me say something about this issue of the Red Sea and why the Trump administration has really diverted major naval forces in the Red Sea and is currently fighting the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea in this unauthorized, congressionally unauthorized war against the people of Yemen. The Western media and Western governments would have people believe that the Red Sea is the world's most important water passageway, when in fact it's not. It's the English Channel. Um, there are roughly 100,000 ships averaged on a daily average out there in the oceans. Roughly 300 on average pass through the Red Sea. That's not the world's busiest waterway. In fact, it's the English Channel, which has roughly twice as many ships going through. Be that as it may, the Houthis did not announce that they would randomly hit any ship going through the Red Sea. They specifically stated that ships linked to Israeli interests or headed to an Israeli port would be targeted. Now, in this regard, they did have intelligence support, and there are, of course, there are revelations in the press, true or not, who knows, but there are revelations that it's not just Russia, but actually China with sophisticated satellite systems, that it has been helping the Houthis target specific ships going through the Red Sea headed for Israeli ports or linked to Israeli interests. So the issue of perspective here is important, that it's not random hits. Now, in January 2025, when the Israelis and Hamas finally agreed on ceasefire, the Houthis stopped targeting ships. However, in the middle of March, in fact, on March 11th, what happened is that the Houthis had intelligence. Not that it was not that it was that secret anyway, because the Netanyahu government was announcing that it was going to resume the war against the civilians in Gaza. It was going to violate the ceasefire, and the Houthis announced that they would resume targeting ships going through the Red Sea headed for Israel or linked to Israeli interests. They had attacked something like 100 ships all along during the genocide war that Israel carried out against the people of Gaza. Now, the on March 15th, the Trump administration announced an congressionally unauthorized war against the Houthis, against Yemen. It targeted civilians, by the way. Civilians, mostly civilians, have been killed. Some Houthi rebels, but it's civilian targets, okay? And 3 days later, sure enough, the official return of full-scale war by Israel in Gaza. So there is a connection here between what the Houthis did, what the US did, what Israel did. This was not random, in other words. If we put the timeline together, you see that the issue here was linked to Israel, and the United States was there partly for that. Now, the United States, however, has its own interest. The United States was concerned and is concerned, especially under the Trump administration, that China was becoming the hegemonic power in the Middle East, and it had preponderant influence given that the number one trading partner of the Middle East is China. By the way, it's not the United States. And then when it revealed, and perhaps this is true, we have no way of verifying, that China was really helping the Houthis with intelligence targeting ships, including U.S. interests, obviously, headed for Israel or linked to Israeli interests. Okay, so there is the regional balance of power that the United States was concerned about, but there is also the global balance of power. That is the U.S.-China relationship. At the same time, Russia was on the side of the Houthis as well as on the side of Iran, as Russia deepened its strategic relationship with Iran and made it very clear at the United Nations Security Council, General Assembly, in various forums from the Kremlin, very clear that it was against Israel, against the continuing war in Gaza, and by extent, obviously, very deeply involved with Iran, and by extension, Iran's allies in Yemen, namely the Houthi rebels. So this is, to put it in a broader perspective, this is really not limited to to the U.S. regional support for Israel, and but also involving Russia and China and the competition between these countries, especially U.S. and China. At the same time, the United States, under Trump, policy was that this is not something that the Saudi Arabians and the United Arab Emirates would oppose, considering they had been in a civil war behind the pro-Sunni regime in Yemen for 8 years fighting that civil war. And they presented, the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates presented as a struggle between themselves and Iran. Okay, so the Trump administration took that into account, and the Trump administration, of course, valued and still obviously does the role of the Gulf states, the Arab states, much more than the Biden administration. The Biden administration was not as warm, as friendly, at least in public. Privately, they got along just fine, by the way. But it was towards Saudi Arabia, an authoritarian regime, and the Gulf states, autocratic regimes that many progressive Democrats don't exactly agree with, their direction, their treatment of women, their treatment, um, their approach to social justice in general. So this is a Trump administration that's far right wing, that's ideologically closer to the autocratic regimes of the Gulf states than the Biden administration. This does not mean that the United States, in substance, had a different policy under Biden than under Trump. It's just harsher under Trump, more militaristic, and also in some respects contradictory, considering the Trump administration has announced that it will do anything, just about anything, to end that war in Ukraine, because it doesn't want military involvement there. It doesn't want NATO expansion into um, Ukraine and the Black Sea, Transcaucasus region, Central Asia. Okay, it doesn't want to threaten the national security interests of Russia. On the other hand, it has no problem launching a new war in Yemen. So this is part of the equation here. Um, the um, the United States, of course, also used, and there has been quite a bit of analysis on this, also used the war against the Houthis, ongoing, by the way, it's still going on. It used again the war against the Houthis as leverage against Iran during the negotiations. The negotiations between the United States and Iran in April 2025 started in Oman, in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf. And they continued with Rome, and they showed progress. And the reason is because Iran went into the negotiations with the model of Saudi Arabia. They knew that the Trump administration had somewhat a different approach to foreign affairs than the Biden administration, namely that foreign policy is more up for sale than it was under Biden. That if you provide a package that's attractive for investors or US investors, if you put that on the table, at the negotiating table, the Trump administration can't resist it. Now, the Trump administration has Witkoff as its chief negotiator, who was a real estate investor and developer, very close, far right wing, by the way, happens to be Jewish, but it doesn't matter. Iran knows that this is an individual that will deal on behalf of the Trump administration um, on issues that will further US capitalist interests. So, what they did is they followed the Saudi United Arab Emirates model of dangling the promise of $1 trillion package if a deal is reached. The Saudis and the United Arab Emirates, some other Gulf states, came, as soon as Trump came in, immediately began to try to befriend the United States government even more than they had before, obviously under Biden, by promising massive packages of investment attractive to Wall Street. Well, Iran came at the negotiating table and put that deal on the table. Namely, the deal was um, that they want to develop. They will give up nuclear weapons development. They will not continue with heavy water production and centrifuges. They will not go that route, but they want the nuclear reactors. They want nuclear energy. And they would be willing to invite American companies as investments, especially investment funds, retirement funds, to come in and invest in the nuclear energy sector. They made it very clear they're going to keep, by the way, a small percentage, I think 3.5% of heavy water development for the possibility of nuclear weapons development, that really negligible. As Iranian scientists have pointed out, if they wanted to have a nuclear weapon, they would have had it by now. But the real issue here, the focus, is on the same that Iran is offering the same kind of package to the United States that the Gulf states are offering. And by the way, Iran was in close consultations with the Saudi Arabians on this issue, how to approach the Trump administration. And the Saudi Arabia, according to reports from Iran, the Saudi Arabian advice was offer them something attractive in terms of investment, they'll buy it. And they did. So far, it is not known if this is going to work out. It may not work out. Now, the alternative, as many analysts in the United States and, of course, in Europe and in the Middle East have pointed out, the alternative is war. Israel, all along, has been lobbying the chief negotiator of the United States, Witkoff, not to accept the deal that Iran has put on the table, to, in fact, have a confrontation. Israel, even when Netanyahu came to the United States and had a talk with Trump, he was not happy that the Trump administration placed the economic interest, the investment interests, Wall Street's interests ahead of what Israel wants, and that is for the U.S. to bomb Iran or give Israel the green light. In fact, there are reports that the U.S. stopped Israel from bombing Iranian sites. There are experts in military affairs who have argued that the military option, as rosier has been portrayed by the Netanyahu government, and what military option has not been portrayed as rosy by the Netanyahu government, and by so-called hawks, the forever war doctrine advocates in the United States, neoconservatives, the fact is that Iran is not like Arab countries in the region. It has enormous capability to cause a lot of damage. This doesn't mean that Iran is going to win a war against the combined forces of Israel and the United States, but it does mean that it has enormous leverage with its own military capabilities. And let's not forget that Russia is behind it. It has a deep strategic relationship with Iran. And economically, China is behind it. Iran is inexorably linked to Russia and China. It is part of what many in the West call the axis of evil. Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, those four countries. Well, be that as it may, the alternative, or the military alternative, that is going to war against Iran, would have been very costly to the entire region, to US interest, and to the world economy, because it would have disrupted the world's energy supply, because that region right there, the Middle East, provides most of the energy. It would have sent energy prices skyrocketing. This was not an alternative. The reckless approach of war hawks, whether the Zionists in the Netanyahu government or in Washington and in think tanks in the United States, that is a reckless approach because it doesn't take into account the global economy and the disruptive effects a Middle East war would have. It's just unthinkable. It's simply unthinkable. Now, I want to say a few things about the United States continuing this war. 8 April 2025 in Yemen. Yemen is a country of 42 million people. 80%, according to the United Nations, 80% are below poverty. The fact is that, according to World Population Statistics sites, Yemen ranks as one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world and the poorest in the Middle East. It has suffered a humanitarian crisis because of the civil war between the Houthis and the Saudi-backed Sunni government since the Arab Spring outbreak. Okay. It has a large population displaced internally and dispersed in other countries. It has huge needs. By the way, the displaced population is placed at 5 million, but it's officially, but it's a lot higher than that. It has enormous humanitarian needs, everything from housing to food, water, clean water, to medication. Yemen is a very poor country, one of the poorest, one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world. To target Yemen, yes, the Houthi rebels, but just like the Israeli government is arguing that we're targeting Hamas, but in the meantime, it's women and children that are getting hit in Gaza. That's why the ICC ruled against Israel with regard to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and of course, genocidal war. This is what happens. As the great American historian, late American historian Howard Zinn pointed out, all wars are against civilians. This is even more so in Yemen. This is a war about U.S. attempt to determine the regional balance of power and the global balance of power. And they chose Yemen because the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, and Israel have no problem with it. They want that. Although Saudi Arabia is having second thoughts, according to some reports. But the United States is going to pursue that. And it's using it to keep the pressure on Iran, by the way, amid these negotiations. Although Iran is going to follow its national interest, by the way, economic and national security interest, perfectly willing, like all countries, to sacrifice the Houthis if it comes to a deal with the United States. Now, we have to remember, by the way, in return for Iran to agree to this deal, it does want lifting of sanctions. There is also the matter of $120 billion of Iranian assets confiscated by the West, mostly by the United States. So the combination of sanctions, confiscated assets, is very important to Iran. Economic development is very important. Iran has hyperinflation. credit is very difficult. It's a cash economy. A huge percentage of the economy, like a typical sub-Saharan African country where there is a substantial portion of the economy operating in the informal sector with cash. This is Iran. And yet Iran is a highly developed, Iran has a highly developed civilization, by the way, with science and technology, um, and a middle class, and it wants to proceed because it has been left behind in this regard, and it wants to proceed given that it is interested in pursuing the model of China, not the militarist model of the West, the NATO countries, but the economic development model of China. It's more interested in that than it is in becoming a military superpower, because Iran is, in fact, um, has recognized since the revolution of 1979, since the Ayatollah Khomeini took over, that this path that they have been on has been futile. It has not served the majority of the people. It has not strengthened the middle class. So Iran's decision has been uh, to opt for economic development and to see if they can get this deal. This is not, by the way, something that's in the bag. I want to caution that a lot of people have jumped the gun. I should tell you, by the way, that Russia has guaranteed, is supporting the US-Iran dialogue on nuclear weapons. China is supporting. Iran has consulted with both, as well as with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is supporting this. So there are major players who are on board of this. China is the major backer, financial and economic development backer of Iran. Russia has gone so far, Vladimir Putin has gone so far as to guarantee Iran, in case the US pulls out of this deal, guaranteed security, that is. Now, in 2018, by the way, Iran learned a very hard lesson. The United States, under Trump, 2018, he was president, pulled out of the nuclear agreement that was multilateral. So now Trump, typical isolationist and bilateral president, interested in bilateral relationships, in other words, rather than multilateral like Biden and Democrats, Trump pulled out. Now he's pursuing a bilateral relationship, one-on-one with Iran. So what we have here is a lot at stake for the entire Middle East. Where this is headed, again, it remains to be seen. There is a great deal of optimism on this issue. There are analysts who believe, including Gulf state Arab analysts who believe, government and independent ones who believe that the deal is most likely in the bag. There are American analysts who believe the same thing. Anything can go wrong. It can be sabotaged. All along, Israel has tried its best to sabotage it, as have American neoconservatives whose interests converge ideologically with Israel on this issue. There are a lot of people who do not want this deal to go through. If this deal does go through, the US will have no choice but to retreat from this war, which, by the way, in Yemen, which, by the way, has been costing enormous amounts of money. There are estimates of billions. Okay. There is something else that has surprised the United States government. It should not have, but it has. Namely, that they have found that they can't win it with just air power. Missiles and drones can't tame the Houthi rebels. They cannot possibly win. The Houthi rebels are seasoned guerrilla fighters, by the way. They did not fold during the long civil war against United Arab Emirates, Saudi alliance. There were I think, 7 countries behind the Saudi, United Arab Emirates, uh, other regional actors, African and Middle Eastern countries, as well as France, UK, and the United States, supplying them with intelligence and arms all along. And still, the Houthis did not lose. The US going at it alone now is paying a huge price. By the way, this is not cost free. This is costing enormous. I have seen estimates of $1 billion a day. Now, this may be an exaggeration, but it is not free. It's costing a lot of money, and in the end, only a ground offensive can prevail in Yemen. The question is the US willing to pay the price in every respect, politically, financially, militarily, for a ground offensive in Yemen, and to destabilize the entire Middle East by so doing? What is there to be gained? My guess is the US will retreat from this war as soon as a deal with Iran is reached. And then that will put all the focus back on the government in Tel Aviv to come to the negotiating table and come to some kind of compromise with the Palestinians and with Gaza. The dream of annexing Israel, annexing Gaza, the dream, the delusional dream of the United States government under Trump, turning Gaza into some kind of French Riviera resort for rich Arabs and non-Arabs alike, with gambling casinos and luxury hotels and apartments, while no Palestinians, unless they work for the in the service sector, for the rich investment companies, for the investment companies in the region. This idea is not feasible. Not even Saudi Arabia, Egypt, which also, by the way, Egypt was also part of the coalition with Saudi Arabia against the Houthi rebels. They don't even support that. So the prospect, everything is riding on the Iranian deal. The prospect of an Iranian deal with the United States on nuclear weapons, which I am convinced by the results that to this day, Israel does have nuclear weapons, by the way. Iran, if it wanted, could, but it does not. It chose not to because they recognize it is not in their interest. And they're now using that as leverage to negotiate economic development with the United States and the West. And the latest news on this issue is that the foreign minister of Iran has now approached the 3 major European countries, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. And it is trying to bring them into the fold because obviously the French are well known historically for developing nuclear reactors, nuclear energy. They're globally known for, in this sector, nuclear reactor development. So they're trying to bring them in. And all of those 3 countries have agreed that there should be a deal between Iran and the United States, that they want the end, once and for all, of Iran giving up the prospect of nuclear weapons in exchange for economic development. So they're all on board on this. China is on board, Russia is on board, Western Europe is on board. The United States will see if the United States and Iran do reach a deal, and whether this will bring peace throughout the Middle East. My guess is it will be a great step forward, but the situation with Israel and Palestine is not going to change substantially. It might improve somewhat, but not change substantially. I thank you for listening. I ask you to write questions, comments, and please join the channel, the People's Discourse channel. It is an educational channel and analyzes issues of global importance. Thank you very much.